Hello, we are live on University Radio Nottingham. This is The Big Picture with Felix
and Thomas Gregory.
Joining us today is far less than what we expected. We are joined by Aaron, a first time on The Big Picture. Welcome, Aaron, to the show.
Thank you very much, man. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Due to personal reasons, we've lost 3 members of our panel. So to compensate for that, we're going to be, Thomas and I are going to go back to what we were doing last year and be sort of host and panelist. So we're going to be breaking our impartiality for this week. So this week we're talking about Russia-Ukraine. Has the UK done enough sanctions on Russia or acted appropriately to the invasion now that occurred? I think we're on day 3 now of the invasion of Ukraine. We'll also be talking about whether or not misogyny should be a hate crime, and we'll be talking about the recent changes to tuition fees. So let's start with Russia-Ukraine. So a couple of days ago now, Russia invaded Ukraine. We've been talking about it for a few weeks on this show, and it has now happened. The UK has responded by sanctioning Putin himself and the foreign minister for Russia. More than 100 companies have also been sanctioned that have links to Putin. They've sent defensive military aid to Ukraine, trained 22,000 Ukrainian troops, offered more defensive weapons, and are providing 100 million of economic reform to make Ukraine energy independent. That's the UK. The UK is calling for Russia to be withdrawn from the SWIFT system, which would basically make it very hard for Russia to trade, because they would have to do everything separately via independent banks rather than going through a system, if I've understood the SWIFT system correctly. France, Italy and the US have also called for this, but it seems that Germany, which already sacrificed the Nord Stream 2, has qualms with this. The EU, some members of the EU have been called by Donald Tusk, former leading member of the EU, I think he was the president of the council. He said that Italy, Hungary and Germany are a disgrace because they blocked certain measures of sanctions from the EU, so that Italy could engage in trading with Gucci handbags with Russian oligarchs.
And Germany because of its dependence
on energy. I apologise if this is wrong, listeners, but I think about 60%
I think that's right. So
Russia's energy comes from
natural gas, I imagine, is it? Or
mainly, yeah. From Russia. So what do we think? What do I think, and what do the panelists think? And Thomas,
what do you think, Aaron?
What do I think? I think it's potentially a bit short-sighted on part of Germany, Italy, and Hungary. I think I can see how it benefits them in the short term, but I think I'm not sure. I think setting a precedent of, this is an extraordinary situation, right? Like a land invasion in Europe for the first time in a significant amount of time. Thank you. But yeah,
it's just a bit of a shit show, isn't it? Really, it's a bit of. I did not expect Putin to actually full send it, but he did, and I'm not entirely sure what he intends to do after he has theoretically captured Kyiv, but as far as I know so far, they're holding off.
They've been doing a really good job, haven't they, the Ukrainians?
And there were more casualties on the Russian side than on the Ukrainian side, at least yesterday.
I think so far, yeah, but I think thankfully that's because Ukrainian forces so far have been having a sort of kind of hurried retreat, but now we're in sort of urban warfare. Like, perhaps that could change. I hope not, of course, but I've been enormously impressed by the Ukrainian population, the government and its military so far.
President Zelensky,
I was going to talk about him, yeah,
doing videos saying I'm still here. He's turned down this morning an offer from the US to have him evacuated.
Yeah, he said we don't need evacuation, we need weaponry, we need support. Yeah.
Do you think that the UK should do more? What could it do more? I mean, SWIFT, it can't really act on that unilaterally. It would have to get the support from the G7, and if Germany's not budging, it's a bit tricky. But is there anything else that the Conservative government can do, Boris can do you think?
Man, I'm not really sure. I mean, that's the question, right? It's just very difficult. So obviously we can't put ground troops, we can't really intervene massively in the air. But yeah, I think if we can provide more weapons, more sort of support equipment, things like that, just anything to help out the Ukrainians, really. Like anything which Ukraine is asking for, which wouldn't provoke a major war in Europe, is something I think that's worthwhile. Obviously, as you say, we couldn't pull Russia out of SWIFT unilaterally, but I think there are more sort of like maybe small things, but in total maybe like perhaps more significant things than we're doing right now.
What do we make to the no-fly zone idea that Tom Tugendhat and Tobias Elwood, I think it was Tobias Elwood, but I'm assuming Tom Tugendhat would also support it based on his other comments, that just shoot down any planes over Ukraine. He claims that this wouldn't lead to war with Russia because it would be in defence of Ukraine, but I suppose
but the thing is, it would lead to war with Russia, wouldn't it?
It would. I mean, already a Turkish ship has been accidentally attacked by the Russians. I say accidentally, I imagine it was. So Turkey's part of NATO, of course.
Well, the question is, right, let's have a think about it. Ukraine, this is quite a difficult context, and Ukraine is an interesting one when it comes to international relations, because it is the border country between NATO, the buffer zone between NATO and Russia, and that's even how it's called, which is a sad reality for the Ukrainians. But on the one hand, you could argue that this reinforces the importance of nuclear weapons, because if it wasn't for nuclear weapons, then there'd be no stopping Putin at this rate, just taking the rest of ex-Soviet land. But you might also say the opposite, insofar as whatever I was going to say. So you could say the opposite in saying that nuclear weapons are, what's the point in them, because they're not deterring Putin from. Then he's not scared of us. And then again, if we're not prepared to use nuclear weapons, then what's the point in having them at all?
It just takes one person calling the bluff, right? It kind of feels like the 30s in that sense. When everybody's so terrified of war, it just takes one nutter, who kind of calls everyone else's bluff. Sorry, Felix.
No, that's all right. I was just saying, isn't this the biggest advert for joining NATO now? Because if you're a member of NATO, Russia isn't going for you.
But the thing is, if Ukraine had joined NATO, it would be all-out war. That's the problem. But it's the very
if it joined now, but if it had already joined NATO in the past, otherwise this is.
Well, no. If Russia, Putin would never have let it happen.
Do you think so? Because if it happened in 2004, which is when the NATO stopped expanding east, then Putin wouldn't have been in the position to do so. I mean, already yesterday, Putin threatened Finland and Sweden, saying that if they considered joining NATO, that there would be military consequences.
What? Yeah. What's that got to do with Russia?
Well, Finland borders Russia, Sweden.
But the thing is, what about your other borderland countries of Russia? Well, when you look at Lithuania, that's right up next to it.
Member of NATO.
Yeah.
But that's why I'm saying. Why does it matter? He hasn't invaded them because.
Well, that's a fair point, but Ukraine is not necessarily about real tactics anymore. It's not like troops kind of walk up and down along into the east as it used to be across the ages. It's more symbolic more than anything else. The whole Ukraine thing, the whole battle over Ukraine is more of a symbolic thing. And how about Felix sharing with us your favourite topic about what Corbyn has been saying with NATO, because there is a legitimate argument that NATO has been prodding the Russian bear and has caused this whole crisis in the first place by not leaving Putin alone and by scaring him and by maybe not giving him the credit as an international leader he thinks he deserves. It's provoked him to show the world his might.
Well, this is an argument that Corbyn has put forward, and interestingly, he's, as he has done on the EU for many years, agrees with Nigel Farage on this issue as well. This goes down to this realist perspective that superpowers have spheres of influence, and it's been put forward by academics as well that the US would not tolerate it if Cuba had joined some sort of military alliance with Russia, and that may be true. Corbyn has condemned the Russian government for the invasion now, but before he was very much parroting the lines that Russia is under threat and that NATO is the aggressor. It was the case that 11 MPs, Labour MPs plus Corbyn, because of course he is an independent MP, had signed the Stop the War coalition saying that NATO was the aggressor, and they were, and this is according to the Mirror, contacted by Sir Gregory Campbell, the Chief Whip of Labour, and said, if you do not withdraw this, we will remove the whip from you. And someone told the Mirror, you can be a member of the Labour Party or a mouthpiece for the Kremlin. You can't be both. And all 11 MPs have now subtracted their signature from Stop the War Coalition piece that said that NATO was the aggressor. Corbyn, as far as I'm aware, his name is still on there, but of course he's already had his whip withdrawn. Ultimately, look, there are some people on the fringes of the political spectrum that are not necessarily pro-Putin but anti-West, which can at least appear to be pro-Putin, whether or not they are
critical of the West, at least.
So, from that perspective, but look, the House of Commons is quite unison on this. Keir Starmer's back in the government. Ian Blackford supported the government on this as well.
Right.
So we are looking at most politicians supporting the Ukrainians.
So what now then? Basically, we've got Zelensky, who is a target, a Russian target, and inevitably, if they get their hands on him, they're not going to treat him very well, are they?
No, I reckon he might commit suicide.
Yeah.
Put that
I think I heard. I don't remember where I heard this. So take this with a pinch of salt. But I heard he was going to be put on trial. So,
yes, that's what I think he said.
That makes me think of another thing. Russia has now stopped any external sources. You're not allowed. I think it's something. There's a new kind of act or a new order that you can't share any media sources that originate out from, that don't come from Russia, that say come from Ukraine.
Yeah, and they banned Facebook and Twitter. I mean,
as a result, porn.
Oh yes.
Porn have done like have blocked Russian people from being able to access it or something.
And it's got a Ukraine flag up. Talking of which, let's look at Twitter. It banned Donald Trump for inciting violence, but President Putin, who's just invaded another sovereign country, still has an account.
Really?
What do you reckon to that?
Oh, is that so?
Yeah.
Oh, that's stupid, isn't it?
And the Taliban, of course, also have an account.
Taliban, blue ticked.
I think one small. I don't know if I would support it, but like the one argument about Trump is that Trump was no longer the president of the United States compared to obviously Putin and Taliban, who are at this time in power.
That is a good point. Because we don't, whether we like Putin or not, he obviously is a big name. We all know of him. Not normally for good things, as I am not impartial on this particular episode. Now here's another suggestion. France has seized, or is speculation, I'm not actually sure if they've actually done this yet, or that they're but they're seizing all Russian properties. Is that something we should be doing in the UK? And actually something that's been suggested in Parliament by Chris. Oh, hello, George.
Wow, nice to see you, George.
Just ask me about Russia-Ukraine, please.
Well, it won't happen.
You don't think it will happen?
I don't think you'll see it happen in the UK.
Hello, George. George has just joined
George
us.
Scotland, everybody.
We have now got two panellists. I was going to say that
I don't think it will happen in the UK. I don't think we have the same attitude like that.
No, and of course the Conservative Party is funded by some Russian oligarchs.
£2 million, something like that.
Yeah, something like
that. Well, and there's this whole thing about Liz Truss and a photo of her with Theresa May and like the other cabinet members. There were 6 of them in with a Russian, like the wife of a Russian oligarch who had donated a significant amount of money to the Conservative Party, and Dan Walker has been kind of like praised on BBC Breakfast on social media for kind of basically saying, aren't you embarrassed by this? And she was like, no.
Well, do you think there is a risk of sort of Russia-phobia in this country? Because Tom Tugendhat has been criticised for, and I think he's been supported.
You mean future Prime Minister Tom
potentially future Prime Minister. He has said and I think Chris Bryant from Labour has also supported it, that all Russian citizens should be removed from the country.
Oh, really?
And there's also been suggestions that dual nationalists should have to choose whether they want to be British or Russian. That's a backbencher. They're both backbenchers. This isn't Labour or Conservative policy. But what do you reckon to that? Is there a risk that people that have nothing to do with Putin but are Russian could be targeted by people that are sympathetic to Ukraine as it struggles continuously against the aggression orchestrated by Putin?
See what George says to that.
Well, no, I think obviously that Russia is supposedly a competitive authoritarian.
It's a bit of the question is really what's going to happen now. I don't think there's any other reason really. I don't know what's going to happen now, because you've got Milosevic, is it what's his name? The Ukrainian President Zelensky.
Yeah.
You've got him stuck in Kyiv, basically surrounded, and we're going to have a brutal, like, enduring conflict. They reckon. Intelligence services have said that there's a brutal like civil war that's basically going to be running for ages on Europe, in Europe, on the same continent, well, arguably Eurasia, and so it's a real shame. The other thing I would add as well is that amongst all this, even though we're all getting het up about Ukraine, which is absolutely fair and it's a terrible situation, I was watching a video yesterday about the state of Afghanistan, and it is truly, like, it's truly terrible. It's horrendous, and well, I think there's an important question about whether it will have applications for us being distracted by the whole Putin-Ukraine situation, whether that will be how that will message across the world in terms of, will we turn blind eyes to humanitarian conflicts and Kazakhstan's civil war and whether we'll forget about all the other things that are going on.
Well, look at China
and China. I was going to say
because China's going to be looking at this, because if the West don't respond strongly enough, what about China and Taiwan? Which will lead to World War III. I mean, there's no question about that, unless Joe Biden forgets about the agreement that they have with Taiwan.
What is the agreement they have with Taiwan?
Basically, if Taiwan is under attack from China, they are USA. It's basically it's like the NATO agreement. Taiwan's not in NATO, but it is the same thing.
Like
gets triggered.
Bilateral NATO agreement, basically.
Yeah.
So we've said several things there. So whether either of you have anything to say on that ramble from the two of us.
And just going back to what you were saying before about Russian citizens, I think sometimes it can be quite harmful to kind of force people to choose a camp. Like the whole with us or against us mentality, I'm not really a very big fan. I think sometimes it can be kind of counterproductive.
Yeah, we have actually been told as student union groups to be careful, in the sense of that it's okay to say that you support Ukraine, but don't let that ostracize Russian students. For example.
I think sometimes you can end up sort of alienating.
Because it's not them. And didn't Boris say something along the lines of, Russia, we know that it's not you.
Yeah. This is Putin.
This is Putin, not you, Russians.
And of course,
it's important to make that distinction.
No, go on, Aaron.
I was just saying, I just think it's very important to make that distinction. So go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, of course, there's protests in Russia going on at the moment against Putin. It's very difficult to know because of the situation of Russia's democracy, and I use democracy in a very, very broad sense.
Government would be
government,
and that's even a push.
About how many people in Russia support Putin and how many don't.
Well, apparently, fairly split.
That doesn't surprise me.
It's more with the younger generation who are liberal and stuff. The ones who actually went out and protested, they're very much more against the Kremlin.
Because Russia's not closed off as much as
a lot of the older generation, like the people who follow.
Well, there's protests on the street and they weren't cleared up.
In favour of.
They won't crack down on.
Well, if this. Sorry, George. Go on. I spoke over you.
Sorry, no. I just said that the younger generation are much more sort of liberalised, cosmopolitan. Educated. The ones who went out to the streets and protested. Obviously very anti Vladimir Putin, whereas obviously the older generation, the ones who are sort of indoctrinated by Russia today, are very much do stand with. So there's like a generational divide there.
Yeah, could I add something onto that? Actually, I think it's a very important point about like where people get their information from. Like obviously, like younger people far more likely to get their information through social media, as you say, far more cosmopolitan, sort of worldwide. Whereas older people, you see interviews with some older people recently who say that the military offensive is only in Donbass, don't lie, it's not the whole of Ukraine sort of thing, which is the line peddled. But I think a lot of it has to do with where people get their information from.
You mean special military operation?
The special military operation,
that's my bad. The peacekeepers that are operating in...
George, anything to say on Russia-Ukraine before we move on?
Really, I'm just concerned about one thing that's been cast onto the back burner is I'm really concerned about sort of the presence of Russia today still within the sphere of the British media. I mean, I sat with Felix the other day and just kind of the lies that were being peddled by it, and it's still
by Felix.
What lies? there's an apparent genocide going on in eastern Ukraine.
But banning Russia today, does that not make the UK, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but does that not make the UK just like Russia?
Oh, I didn't know Russia Today was
media?
banned.
It isn't banned.
Oh, okay.
The debate
say
about
that
it.
if the UK
I mean, Alex Salmond's on Russia
well,
Today.
he suspended his
suspended
his show.
Oh, I didn't know that.
George Galloway to do it now.
But Alex Salmond has long been a sort of sympathiser of Putin, and this has been criticised by the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon. Of course, Alex Salmond is no longer in the SNP. He has his Alaba party now.
No, I get what Felix said about you're talking some sort of like freedom of speech perspective, right? But I still find it very frightening that can still be allowed to be aired,
Yeah, no, I completely get your point. Before we move on, I just want to say one more thing to you, George, because I know you watched it, because we watched it together. Joe Biden did a press conference recently, he smiled and laughed several times about Russia, Ukraine.
He did.
I also saw on the news the other day that he said there will be a war between Ukraine and Ukraine. Do you think there's any weakness to the Biden administration that's made Putin think he should invade now? But bearing in mind the fact that Trump is a Putin sympathiser.
And the amount of aid that got blocked to Ukraine under Trump times too.
And the whole thing, yes.
I'm not really entirely sure, Felix, about Biden. I think what you got to understand is that he is a little bit old and useless, but don't conflate his manner in terms of his kind of fairly happy and like positive and happy old grandfather kind of vibe with the actual administration not having any competence, because there are plenty of people who know what they're doing, and frankly the politicians don't really have a huge amount of input on the military tactics, really. I don't think behind the scenes the military know what they're doing, and Biden is merely a figurehead who's propped up by his other helpers.
That is very true, but you also have to consider with Putin that a lot of it is to do with perception also, that he might not be familiar as much with the rest of the administration compared to Joe Biden.
Possibly.
So, as a sort of figurehead, that it might still be perceived as weakness on the American part.
Well, I think that was one of the big criticisms actually from the Republicans towards the Democrats a lot of the time, is their attitude to war. But then again, you look at the history of America, and both sides have done plenty of warring. So
war and isolating as well, and not getting involved when perhaps they could have got involved earlier.
So it's pretty difficult. Right, should we move on? We're gonna have a little break now, and I thought we'd put on some Rasputin here.
Welcome back to The Big Picture with Felix and Thomas Gregory. Our second topic is: should misogyny be a hate crime? Well, this is because Priti Patela said, no, it shouldn't. This debate has been happening more prominently since the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer. Scotland, interestingly, led by the SNP, have also not made misogyny a hate crime. They didn't include it in one of their bills, how many years ago? I think it was about 3 years ago now. And there are no plans now for the UK to do the same. So let's take a look. What is the definition of a hate crime? I looked it up just a moment ago. So the definition of a hate crime is: a hate crime is any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or anybody else to be motivated by the hostility or prejudice towards someone who is based on their race, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or disability.
Yes, so sex is not in that. Perceived by is the other.
Perceived by. One. Some people that have said no, politicians this is, to misogyny being a hate crime, are based on the fact that being a woman is not a minority. So there seems to be a correlation in the minds of some politicians.
Doesn't mean you're not oppressed, though.
That only a minority can be oppressed. But let's look at South Africa, of course. The black population in South Africa were the majority, but they were oppressed by the white minority there. So what do you think? It's a bit of a... It's very... I suppose one of the questions is, where is the line drawn? That seems to be a common debate about misogyny. What does everyone think on this topic?
I mean, what you can say is that sex is a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act of 2010.
So it's under it's protected under the Equalities Act.
Yeah, it's a
But
protected
it is not a
characteristic,
hate
but it's
crime.
not
That
a
is
hate
interesting.
crime.
Why do you think that is?
I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure either, but
I don't really see why it shouldn't be, frankly. If it's protected under the Equalities Act, if you are discriminated based purely because you're a man or a woman, if it really is as simple as that, which it might not be, but if it's really as simple as that, then can hate crimes be committed against somebody just because they are a woman or just because they are a man? I imagine yes. I don't know the data or the stats on it.
No,
I imagine more
so,
if you're a woman than a man. So I don't know. I
suppose if you can find evidence to suggest that the attack was based on the fact that
I'm going to say yes.
on the
Why
basis
not?
of, like, you know, say an incel attacks someone, for example, like someone that's especially misogynistic
against women, then it should be a hate crime. Because if you're
well, I'd rather have that protect. I'd rather be protected. If I don't want to be committing any hate crimes, and if one's committed against me because I'm a man, then
it makes sense, I suppose. If we're saying you can be attacked based on a hate crime, can be based on race or sexuality, then
the challenge
generally is the case that sex and gender are normally included in those sort of remits.
But I imagine the challenge, we were having a discussion earlier about this, the challenge is how far do you go with characteristics that you are discriminated on? So there are lots of other characteristics that people might have.
Ginger-haired people often get. I'm not trying to correlate that with the misogynistic abuse against women, but as an example, people with ginger hair often get attacked. I don't know with disabilities. I mean, what extent is that? Does it only include physical disabilities, or does that include mental disabilities?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, people. I don't know. Everybody fits into some characteristics, right? So everybody can be discriminated against on the basis of something, right? But what I would ask is, what would be, say for example, if somebody, let's say there are two situations where someone is murdered. Someone is murdered, and then a second person is murdered on the basis that they are a woman. What would be the difference legally in terms of it being a hate crime? It's like, what would be the difference in sort of like the consequences of that on the basis that it's a hate crime?
If it's a hate crime, then judges can give tougher sentences.
Okay.
Towards. So that would be, in terms of the consequence of making misogyny a hate crime, would be sort of broadly twofold. One would be the sort of symbolism that misogyny is a hate crime, and second of all would be the fact that people who commit misogynistic offences would spend longer in prison than someone who attacks someone based on something else. I suppose if they've wronged them or something
for some arbitrary reason.
Yeah, for some arbitrary reason.
Okay.
Right. I've got some more things here about just discrimination overall. There's some interesting challenges, and they're left out of both the Equalities Act and anything to do with hate crimes. Understandably not to do with hate crimes, because these are not really something that you'd probably be discriminated based on a hate crime. But research suggests that an average increase in a man's height by 1 inch at age 16 from, I don't know, starting from what height, it increases male adult wages by 2.6%. So taller men, partly because taller men tend to be more intelligent. That is a correlation based on affluence and upbringing more than anything else. And also, more than 1 in 4 employees have experienced discrimination due to their looks, most often to women. So
but I suppose
there are other features. The point is there are other these are not protected characteristics under any legal thing. However, there is data that suggests that people do have a noticeable receive a noticeable impact as a result of these things. So,
well, should these things also be made hate crimes, or is there a significant difference that misogynistic crimes, without looking at the stats, I'm just assuming this is the case, and correct me if you've seen anything to the contrary, but misogynistic crimes are likely to be higher than Thomas's example of height of males. So should it be based on the commonality of attacks, or the severity of attacks, or the size of the group? What should be the sort of the metric that decides what is and what isn't a hate crime? Or should it just be anything? If you attack someone based on anything of their characteristics that's got nothing to do with
sort
them as a person individually, should that be a hate crime? Right, fat people.
Toughie. I suppose the difference, like mentioned before, like of course with being fat, to an extent you can kind of control that relative to other characteristics, but yeah, I don't know what would be the kind of the spectrum of a hate crime, like, but I'm not sure.
It's an interesting one. I mean, we're probably not going to be seeing misogyny becoming a hate crime anytime soon, because
I'm surprised by that.
Because the Conservative government aren't backing it. I don't know Labour's position on it.
What are the arguments against this?
Well, Priti Patel was saying, I think it was Priti Patel that was saying, I don't want to misquote her, but I think it was something to do with the fact that women are not a minority. I think they were linking it to that hate crime would be against a minority. But then, that being said, I imagine that if you were, although this is very rare in this country, if you were to commit a crime against someone because they were white, that would probably still be considered a hate crime, and that is the majority of the country. I've read that it is about women because of not being a minority.
Yeah.
But that seems to be the only opposition I've read. It doesn't mean there are more arguments of the government and the SNP government.
Too broad a category, apparently.
Too broad a category.
But does that just... I don't know. It doesn't make much sense to me. I don't see why that should be like any less significant of a crime on that basis.
Yeah, if you attack someone because they're a woman, you're doing that.
Okay. There's also a question of resources.
Yeah, that's probably the bigger thing.
Former chairwoman of the National Police Chiefs Council, Sarah Thornton, argued police forces were too stretched as it was, telling a conference in 2018, "We just do not have the resources to do everything that is desirable and deserving." And I mean, I guess there's also an argument, not necessarily a very nice one, but of priorities.
True, but then I think if we're still being not impartial anymore, I think that you can't not make something a law because you don't have the resources to implement it.
Exactly.
I think that's more of an argument to fund the police more.
Yeah.
Because,
good point.
They could say the Metropolitan Police have too many knife crimes to deal with, that they should just not bother prosecuting people anymore. But obviously, that's a crime. Nottinghamshire Police, interestingly, are the only police force in the country that do deal with and treat misogyny as a hate crime.
Yeah, in 2016, Nottingham Police started recording crimes motivated by sex or gender on an experimental basis, effectively making misogyny a hate crime.
Do you have any final comments, Aaron, before we move on to our last topic on this one?
I'm just thinking about the resource argument, because the whole question of a hate crime, that's after a person is caught now. It's not like we won't pursue it's not in question of we won't pursue a person on this basis, right? It's like, it's a question of sentencing, as you mentioned earlier, right? So I don't see how it would be like a large, like significant strain on resources.
So it'd be more of a strain on the judiciary, I suppose.
Yeah.
And the court, the Crown Prosecution Service,
and the prison system also.
Also, the other criticism, I guess, is does that mean we can't wolf whistle anymore? Mother-in-law jokes are out. It's political correctness gone mad. They're the kind of...
Well, I think there's a difference between mother-in-law jokes and
a hate crime,
and a wolf whistle,
and a hate crime.
I think these sort of things would need to be clarified. Yeah, because
isn't some of the argument that some of this behaviour is then leading to misogynistic?
Cultural.
Yeah,
but you also do have a rise of people, particularly in our generation, that. Well, it depends. I've got to phrase this correctly, but people that will make sexist and other jokes, but aren't sexist. I know, but you might argue if you use a sexist joke, you are therefore sexist no matter what. But people sometimes say things they don't mean as a joke. Now, I'm not saying that's right.
Well, we were talking about Jimmy Carr, weren't we?
Like Jimmy Carr.
Yeah.
But what does that? How do you make that difference? I think again, you can make. I suppose these are the sort of things that would need to be clarified in law about what would constitute a hate crime. There's going after a woman in the street and harassing her or attacking her because she's a woman is one thing. Making a joke about a mother-in-law is different. I imagine the law. It's already the case with race. People tell racist jokes and don't get arrested for it. I suppose we'll end on that.
Okay, quick break. Got some Billie Eilish here. Oh, hello and welcome back to The Big Picture with Thomas Gregory.
And Felix Thomas, yes. We're on the panel as well today.
Basically, tuition fees, government, what are they doing? The repayment term for student loans will be extended from 30 years after graduation to 40 years with the cohort that might be this coming year or the year after.
I think it's the year after.
Meaning that many students will still be paying repayments into their early 60s. And the income threshold will be lowered from 27,000 to 25,000, although they will not have the interest rate above that. It will just stay with the retail price interest, the recommended retail price. For us, however, it has frozen at the threshold has frozen at £27,000. That too was meant to rise with inflation, but didn't. I think we got off there compared to what I think they were at some point suggesting. I think we were going to have to pay a bit more, but they knew that there'd be riots. So basically, the government, the Treasury, is trying to claw back a bit of money. The way they're doing that is through student loans. Before I go on an absolute tirade, is there anybody else? Is there anything? You want to say anything?
Enjoy your tirade.
That's all I'll say.
Well, can I
go on, Felix,
I'll just briefly. First of all, I'm interested to know what the Liberal Democrats think about this. And
well, they would oppose it, I'd have thought.
Well,
who knows what the Lib Dems?
Secondly, I think that this politically, and I'm not saying I endorse it, but I think it politically makes sense.
Oh,
because the government needs money, and I'm not saying I'm endorsing it. I'll say why I don't necessarily endorse it afterwards. But I'm just saying it politically makes sense from the government's point of view because they need money to fund the NHS and other remits. And we're not their voter base, so it makes sense to target people that aren't going to vote for them.
Right.
But this is going to affect people on lower incomes, obviously, by default. That isn't good. I don't think necessarily it will detract people from poorer backgrounds going to university any more than the current system.
Some think it might.
But
yeah, it's definitely for some people.
Well, I suppose in the sense of I don't think to a large extent. I don't, but I don't know.
I mean, you still have the same money. It's just going to be an even more of a payback.
It's going to affect people more the other side. People that don't necessarily after going to university, they don't necessarily get the best jobs that they thought they were going to get, or so it will affect them, the poorest, the hardest, and of course, the poorest are the people that can't afford it.
The winners are the very well paid, who will see their maximum loan repayments fall by more than 25%, apparently. So,
well, that's a classic.
Is this a classic Tory thing?
Classic.
Yeah. Well, it looks like the way. It certainly looks like the way.
It doesn't look. To me, this looked. I mean, they knew that it would disadvantage poor people and advantage people who take out or don't take out the loan or pay back really quickly. So, frankly, right. They're not even apologising for it, and even though they are getting 600 million back into the Treasury, which might be important to do, especially after we've had an economic situation, it's not really very good for us who've had a bit of a crap university.
No, and of course it is us that have rightly so in my opinion. As I'm enjoying my
as well.
as I'm breaking my impartiality, I do think it was right for us to sacrifice what we did for the greater good of the country. But
with COVID, you're saying?
With COVID, But now people, and this will be the generation that missed out on a lot of their important schooling, that will be having to pay more of this, and paying until your 60s, it is gonna hit the pocket. You're gonna notice, I think, this. I just want to clarify about my point about affecting poorer people from going to university. I'm saying that I don't think it will have too much more of an impact than the system that it already is.
Yeah. So politically, in the electoral sense, for the Conservative Party.
And I think electorally it makes sense for the Conservatives to do it. It doesn't mean I necessarily agree with that move.
Points from the panel on this? Any opinions?
I'll say just a very quick thing. I think like the people that will be put off by the increased debt are people who are far more future conscious, which are the people you kind of want at university.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Yeah.
So you're kind of putting off the cream of the crop, aren't you? Really, in some ways.
It'll be interesting to see if this affects university numbers because for the past 2 years, for the first time ever, more than 50% of the
it's mental
18 to 19 cohort are going to university. Compare that to our parents' generation, where the numbers were roughly in the 30%.
Look.
It's huge increase.
I think the whole system's totally wrong, and I am totally breaking impartiality here. We have a situation where the government pays for people to do degrees, some of which are people on and doing degrees that shouldn't really be being done at not very good universities, and we're kind of propping up we're propping up
what
business.
You said on this radio show last year, actually, Thomas, about letting letting a certain type of universities die.
I think that there are certain universities. There's a greed, right, to the university system where they're siphoning money from the government, and they know what's happening, and it's. I don't think this is fixing the problem, which is the fact that maybe too many people go to university. Potentially.
I think so. I think too many people do go.
And they certainly there are too many university courses that are not worth the amount of money that is being spent on them. That doesn't mean that I think that medicine courses should be more than the 9,250 quid that they already are. I'm not saying that prices should increase at all and should necessarily be aggregated based on how good the subject is. I just don't. I think there are a lot of underlying problems here with the whole university system, and the reason why the government's not getting a lot of money back is maybe because they're not providing the value that they said they would, or the obvious fact that there's a glut of graduates and intelligent people, a lot of them who want good jobs, and there aren't necessarily all the good jobs there. So it's really difficult. This is a major systemic thing, and it is not solved by this, really.
Well, I think we might have to wrap up now so we can make way for the next show. But this has been The Big Picture with Felix Hawes.
And Thomas Gregory.
Thank you, Aaron, for coming on, and thank you, George, for your contribution.
For appearing.
And gracing us with your great presence.
Oh, thank you.
And George and I have discussed many of these issues repeatedly throughout the week. Okay, thank you very much, and see you again next week. Thank you for listening.
Goodbye.
Bye.